Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another First Friday event sponsored by the Town of Woodside's Art and Culture Committee. I hope you've had a wonderful summer. This evening's program is going to be very special because of the guest who's presenting it for us. Now, often, since these programs are not live at this time, people often want to ask questions of the presenters. And so be sure to take advantage of writing any questions that you might have to the presenter in the chat room. Now, as I mentioned, this is sponsored by the Woodside Arts and Culture Committee, a group of like-minded volunteers here in the town of Woodside trying to provide interesting program for you to enjoy. And this evening's program is especially interesting for two reasons. One, it's by a very famous and exciting artist and amazing human being. And though that could often be said about the presenter himself, Jim Caldwell, who is an amazing artist. He started when he was quite little and he won an art prize. He went on to study art at Williams College, traveled around the world, studied in Paris, and then, if that wasn't sufficient enough, he went to Yale and got his degree in architecture. And we are fortunate that he lives here in Woodside, one of our local treasures, and is here this evening presenting the wonderful program about Michelangelo. You know, Michelangelo is very famous, mostly for his sculptures of David, for instance, and people often say, Michelangelo, you were an amazing genius. And he would reply, if people only knew how hard I worked to get my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful or easy at all. And that could probably be said about any artist, how hard they work to be inspired, to hone their techniques and go forward and produce the amazing visions that they have. You know, Michelangelo also said, the best artist has that thought alone, which is contained within the marble shell. Only the sculptor's hand can break the spell to free the figures. And this evening, we are fortunate to have Jim with us, who's going to break the spell and free Michelangelo to us. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Jim to this evening's First Friday event. Good evening, Jim.
Good evening. As you know, I'm an architect and a painter, and so far I've presented art talks only about my favorite painters. Michelangelo, arguably the greatest artist in the history of Western art, is my first sculptor. I've always wondered why an artist would choose sculpture over painting, so I asked my close friend, architect Phil Monteleone, why he had chosen sculpture for his avocation. He responded, it was only in the first couple of years of practice as an architect that I picked up Irving Stone's The Agony and the Ecstasy, and reading about Michelangelo's apprenticeship, chipping at paving stones, and then working in the Medici gardens, I fell in love with the idea of carving something. It was the physicality and release of banging away on a stone that attracted me, and the mystery of finding a figure within an amorphous block by careful excavating, unquote. Perhaps the very physical Michelangelo felt the same way. I'm going to start with a thumbnail biography. I will be coming back to all of the monuments I show you in this introduction. This portrait of Michelangelo was painted when he was 70. He had almost no gray hair. Michelangelo was born on the 6th of March, 1475, in a small Tuscan town near Arezzo. We are so lucky that he was born in a time and a place when the creative arts were flowering as they had never had before, the Italian Quattrocento, or Renaissance. Although Italy, then compromised of many competing city-states, was in political turmoil, there was great wealth, and there were enlightened patrons like Leonardo da Vinci in Florence and the various popes in Rome. Michelangelo was more than a generation younger than Leonardo da Vinci and 8 years older than Raphael. I will touch on Michelangelo's interesting connection with both of these artists. Soon after Michelangelo was born, the family moved back to Florence, where they had been for generations. When he was a young boy, there was plenty of stone being carved in the quarries around Florence, but it was all being done by stonemasons for the many buildings under construction. Donatello was Florence's last great sculptor, and he had been dead for over 20 years. At age 13, his father enrolled Michelangelo as an apprentice in the studio of the successful fresco painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. Even though he applied himself to learning the art of fresco painting, Michelangelo knew already at 13 that he wanted to be a sculptor of marble. He later joked that his wet nurse was the wife of a stonemason, and she had had marble dust in her milk. A turning point in Michelangelo's life came when he was 14. Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence, asked Ghirlandaio for his two best pupils. Michelangelo was chosen to become a student of the sculptor Bertoldo Giovanni in the Medici Gardens, launching him on his career as a sculptor of marble. During his lifetime, Michelangelo went back and forth between Florence and Rome, usually at the request of a patron, with side trips to Carrara to choose blocks of white marble, and Bologna. He spent the last years of his life in Rome rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica. He died of a stroke in Rome shortly before his 89th birthday on February 18th, 1564. We are fortunate that the Italian painter and architect Giorgio Vasari, who published the world's first art history book in 1550, was a good friend of Michelangelo's. His book covers 23 of the great artists of the Italian Quattrocento, and his longest chapter is about Michelangelo. Michelangelo thought that Vasari was too effusive in his praise, so he asked artist Ascanio Condivi to write a competing biography, published 3 years later. Michelangelo became the first Western artist to have not one, but two biographies published in his lifetime. We are lucky to have those primary sources. Irving Stone's The Agony and the Ecstasy is also filled with wonderful insights. We only have time to look at 16 of about 50 significant marbles which he sculpted in his lifetime, a truly extraordinary body of work, even if one discounts all of the other artistic achievements. Because of the whims of his patrons and because of his inability to say no to the Pope, Michelangelo also carved in wood, cast in bronze, painted in tempera and fresco, and practiced architecture. We will see that his creative brilliance came through each one of these media. To be a stone carver, one first had to make one's own tools out of tempered steel, pointed ones, chiseled shapes, and rake shapes. Long before super hard alloys of steel, these tools dulled quickly and had to be constantly renewed. Most stone sculpting today is with power tools. Michelangelo learned the art of carving from the stonemasons, who had a rhythm of 3 counts of hammer blows and 4 counts of rest, which allowed them to work all day without tiring. It was also helpful that he was ambidextrous. Even though eyeglasses were invented in the 13th century, he developed a habit of blinking to protect his eyes just as the hammer hit the chisel. Before starting to carve, he did many drawings and often did wax or clay study models. Michelangelo, then only 15, decided that his first carving would be a low relief sculpture now known as the Madonna of the Stairs. Although less challenging than a sculpture in the round, to create an illusion of depth in low relief is difficult. The Madonna is sitting on a square block, filling the relief from top to bottom. She lifts her robe to nurse the Christ child, whose right arm is twisted backwards over his mother's left arm, suggesting that he may have fallen asleep. The stairs in the background with their playing children are rendered in perfect perspective. The fabric of the Virgin's garment at the corner of the block is rendered very beautifully. When Michelangelo was 17, since he could not get nude models, which were illegal, banned by Savonarola, he decided that the best way to learn about anatomy was by the dissection of cadavers, also illegal at the time. In exchange for this carved wooden crucifix, he gained the keys to a morgue for indigents at the Church of Santo Spiritu. This touching, completely naked Christ is true to the scriptures. Every night for many weeks, he dissected and drew the bodies by candlelight. Michelangelo sculpted this spatially complex tour de force just 2 years after the Madonna of the Stairs, and it is a huge leap. It is still on a marble panel, but now Michelangelo is showing off his deep understanding of the male anatomy, with about 20 interlocking bodies in many contorted poses. Spatial depth is created by the overlapping human forms. On the left are 2 figures preparing to throw large stones into the melee. This is unlike anything carved by Michelangelo's predecessors or contemporaries. On the basis of a few more early sculptures, when he was 21, Michelangelo was summoned to Rome by a powerful cardinal to do a Bacchus, which would be his first larger-than-life sculpture. Bacchus is the god of wine. Here, a clearly tipsy Bacchus, his hair filled with grapes, holds up a beautiful cup of wine. An impish satyr nibbles at the grapes, which Bacchus is holding in his left hand. I love the decorative nature of the grapes, which are in contrast to the smooth simplicity of Bacchus's naked body. Michelangelo already has a firm grasp of male anatomy, which looks so real. When Michelangelo finished it, the cardinal rejected it as too sinful. It was ultimately bought by the cardinal's banker. When Michelangelo was only 23, he was commissioned to carve a Pietà for the funerary chapel in the original St. Peter's. This was to become his first great masterpiece. Here is an image of the original church, which would ultimately be replaced by a design by none other than Michelangelo. Stay tuned for that story. To the right of the church is the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo's interpretation of the Pietà, with the dead body of Christ sprawled across his youthful mother's lap, was unprecedented in Italian sculpture. To the criticism the Virgin Mary is too young, he explained to his biographer Condivi, purity enjoys eternal youth. Mary holds out her left hand as if to offer her son to God. Vasari rhapsodizes, no sculptor, not even the most rare artist, could ever reach this level of design and grace, nor could he, even with hard work, ever finish, polish, and cut the marble as skillfully as Michelangelo has done here. And Condivi adds, so great and so rare is its beauty that no one beholds it but is moved to pity. A figure truly worthy of the humanity which belonged to the Son of God and to such a mother, unquote. There are so many exquisite details. Mary's face is filled with such love and pity as she looks down at her son. I love her cape, which starts with the folds on her forehead and sweeps gracefully over her shoulders. Because the Pietà sits high above the floor, one cannot normally see Christ's face. Suffering has left no trace on that face, which shows just a hint of a young man's beard. His lips are slightly parted. The nail holes are barely visible in Christ's hands and feet. The drapery under Christ is so natural looking that it's hard to believe that it is carved in stone. Notice the fold of fabric which is between the fingers of Christ's right hand. Vasari adds, quote, it is absolutely astonishing that the hand of an artist could have properly executed something so sublime and admirable in a brief time, and clearly it is a miracle that a stone, formless in the beginning, could ever have been brought to the state of perfection, which nature habitually struggles to create in the flesh. Let's look at a few more subtle details. Notice the blood vessel running down Christ's right arm, Mary's splayed fingers holding a fabric which in turn holds Christ, and the small cut in his ribs. Michelangelo spent only 2 years carving this masterpiece, finishing it when he was 25. This Pietà immediately established the young Michelangelo as the best sculptor in Italy, if not Europe. He was surely divinely inspired. The story of David begins with a 17-foot-high 10-ton piece of Carrara marble, which had been languishing in the cathedral churchyard in Florence for 25 years. The intent had always been for someone to carve a biblical David from it, but until 1501, no one had been up to the challenge. It had been badly started by Simone de Fiesole some years before, and he had abandoned his efforts. Leonardo da Vinci, who had become famous for his Last Supper, finished 5 years earlier, had been offered the piece, but he felt that sculpture was a second-rate craft. Michelangelo came back to Florence when he was 26 to persuade the church that he could do it. This David has been cast in bronze by Donatello in 1440. It had come to symbolize the defense of civil liberties embodied in the Republic of Florence. His version, true to the scripture, was of a defiant young shepherd boy, nude except for a hat and boots, standing over the head of the slain Goliath. Donatello's David is 5 feet tall. Michelangelo's David is 17 feet tall. Michelangelo sculpted a very different version of David. The historian Scott Shield says that this David is a blend of psychological insight and physical realism, sculpted with an intensity never seen before. Here is a fully grown man with a head of thick curly hair, preparing to do battle with the giant. His body is tense, twisted, ready to move, an intense stare with a sling over his shoulder. For his pose, Michelangelo employed contrapposto, meaning that most of David's weight is on one foot, causing the hips to angle in the opposite direction from the shoulders. Look at the detail of the veins in the right hand and the subtle ridge above the thigh, and look at the subtlety of the musculature of David's abdomen and the navel. Michelangelo had learned his anatomy well. David is probably the most recognized work of Renaissance sculpture, a symbol of strength and youthful beauty. Michelangelo had finished his second masterpiece in 2 years. He was not yet 30. A committee, including Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli, was formed to decide where to place the sculpture, which was originally intended for the roof of the cathedral. The David was placed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. In 1873, it was moved into the Accademia Museum, where it stands today. At the Palazzo Vecchio, it was replaced with a reproduction because the marble had been weathering excessively. The colossal size of the statue is truly impressive. It's interesting to compare the thin, wasted legs of the 33-year-old Jesus with the powerful legs of the much younger David. In 1505, when Michelangelo was 30, he was summoned back to Rome by the newly elected Pope Julius II, who, like many popes, had an oversized ego. He wanted Michelangelo to immediately start working on his tomb, which was to be a separate structure covered with 40 figures, a lifetime's worth of work for any mortal. Michelangelo worked on the tomb for 40 years, with many interruptions, and only completed 6 of the figures, 2 of which are now in the Louvre. We will come back to them. This is the final, greatly scaled down version of the tomb, with Julius's sarcophagus at the center of the second level. The first and largest figure of the tomb was Moses, more than twice life size. Vasari wrote, Michelangelo finished the Moses unequaled by any modern or ancient work. Seated in a serious attitude, he rests with one arm on the tablets, and the other arm, and with the other holds his long glossy beard. The hairs so difficult to render in sculpture, being so soft and downy that it seems as if the iron chisel must have become a brush, unquote. Michelangelo has placed Moses' left leg back as if Moses is ready to spring up from his seat. It is curious that he has pulled the folds of the drapery back from Moses' right knee, revealing a traditional legging. Vasari tells us that, quote, the Jews went every Saturday in troops to visit and adore this statue of Moses as a divine, not a human thing. The horns on Moses' head are a traditional depiction, which is thought to be an incorrect interpretation when the original text was translated into Latin. Michelangelo's sculptural skills are clearly evident in Moses' luxuriant beard. Notice the powerful muscles and veins in Moses' arms. Now we're going to shift gears to talk about Michelangelo's extraordinary contributions to the Sistine Chapel. He was now the most famous sculptor in Italy, but he had learned the art of fresco painting as a young boy in the studio of Ghirlandaio. In 1965, I was spending a year in Europe before going to graduate school in architecture. I had a list of the many European masterpieces I had studied as an art history major at Williams College. When I got to Rome, I had to see Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. This is what I saw. Frescoes which were covered with 500 years of candle smoke and grime. It appears to be a black and white photo until you notice the blue on the walls. When we returned to Rome with our children 30 years later, in 1995, the frescoes had been restored to their former glory. The results were absolutely stunning. Modern lighting is also helpful. Here is a close-up showing before and after the restoration with the glorious colors which Michelangelo had painted. This is what the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel looked like in 1508 before Michelangelo started. Gold stars on a light blue sky. Notice that the ceiling is a simple barrel vault with lunettes or triangular shapes above each of the windows. The walls have been painted by many famous artists, including Botticelli, but they would soon be overshadowed by Michelangelo's transformation of the ceiling. The story of how it came to be is fascinating, filled with petty jealousy and intrigue. The architect Bramante, 31 years older than Michelangelo, who was a close friend of the Pope, did not like the young Michelangelo, who was much more famous than he, and wanted him to fail. He persuaded the Pope to summon Michelangelo from Florence to Rome and demand that he fresco 12 apostles onto the ceiling of this important chapel. Never afraid to speak his mind, Michelangelo fought with the Pope, protesting angrily that he was a sculptor, not a painter. But ultimately, he felt that he had no choice. His ambitions got the better of him immediately, and he decided to turn the ceiling into the largest painting in Western art. He took his inspiration from the book of Genesis. He hired a number of experienced fresco painters, but after reviewing their work, decided that he would have to paint the whole ceiling by himself, with the assistants only doing the plaster work and the paint preparation. It ultimately covered 7,400 square feet, including the Last Judgment on the end wall, painted 30 years later. Working sometimes 20 hours a day, finishing the ceiling in just 4 years when he was only 37. Together, they include over 600 figures. It's ironic that the 12 apostles originally requested by the Pope never made it to Michelangelo's ceiling. To fully appreciate this extraordinary effort, let's review the art of fresco. Here's a very small detail representing part of a day's work. Fresco is painting with water-based pigments on a wet plaster surface. The pigments are absorbed into the wet plaster, reacting with the lime, and form an image which will last for thousands of years, like the Roman frescoes in Pompeii. A full-size drawing or cartoon must be made for the day's work. Then a small spike wheel is run around the contours of the drawing, creating a line of small holes. Then just enough thin wet plaster for the day's work is applied to the base surface. The cartoon is then placed over the surface, and a bag of chalk is tapped on the lines of holes, transferring the contour lines to the wet plaster. The cartoon is removed, and the pigments, which have had to be ground and mixed with just the right amount of water, are applied to the surface with a brush. The paints are transparent, like watercolors, with the white being the color of the plaster. In this detail, one can see the extent of the day's plaster, or giornate, which goes slightly beyond the figure. Clearly, frescoing was a team effort, with Michelangelo's assistants doing most of the heavy lifting. I have not mentioned that in addition to his artistic skills, Michelangelo was also a fine poet. After he had started the ceiling and wished that he hadn't, he wrote this: "My stomach is squashed under my chin. My beard is pointed at heaven. My brain is crushed in a casket. My brush above me at all times, dribbling paint so that my face makes a fine floor for the droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine is all knotted from folding over itself. I am bent taut as a Syrian bow. My painting is dead. Defend it for me, for Zari. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter." Michelangelo had designed and built a freestanding scaffolding spanning the 46-foot width of the chapel, covering half of it, over 60 feet in the air, so that services could be performed underneath. The scaffolding, reached by a 40-foot ladder, had to be stepped so that it was a uniform distance from the curved ceiling. When he had finished the first half, which includes 3 scenes of Noah plus Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the impatient Pope ordered him to take the scaffolding down. Soon all of Rome was talking about this breathtaking new masterpiece. Because of the scaffolding, Michelangelo had never seen the fresco from the floor, and he concluded that he had painted too much detail, not visible from 60 feet away. Imagine admiring a painting in a gallery from a distance of 60 feet. On the left is the Great Flood, which is on the first half of the ceiling. There are many, many small figures fading into the distance. On the right is God dividing light from darkness, which is on the second half. The figures are big and bold. Michelangelo greatly simplified the second half, which includes the creation stories. The young prodigy Raphael, who was frescoing the Pope's private chambers, which were not visible to the public, jealously tried to persuade the Pope to let him paint the second half of the ceiling. As you would expect, Michelangelo, basking in the praise of Rome, refused to relinquish the project. He was now known as Il Divino, the divine one. Condivi pointed out that Raphael had remarked numerous times that he was thankful to have been born in Michelangelo's time, as he had acquired his style from the older artist. Michelangelo's first stroke of brilliance was to transform the simple barrel vault into something far more complex and interesting with architectural illusion. With the multiple vanishing points, shadowing, and perfect architectural precision, he created a rich spatial illusion of cornices, corbels, spandrels, and pendentives. The Sibyls and prophets are no longer in a two-dimensional frame, but actually sitting on the architectural details, projecting into space. It is fantastic that Michelangelo had combined figures which are meant to look like they are carved in white marble with figures which are meant to look like they are painted on a two-dimensional surface, with medallions meant to look like they are made of bronze, with figures which are meant to look like real people projecting from the ceiling. Remember that this is a smooth barrel vault. With most of the figures male and nude, he has demonstrated a profound sculptural understanding of every muscle of the human body. With 343 figures on the ceiling, one would be hard pressed to find two which are even close to the same pose. With amazing variety, he has twisted the figures in every conceivable way. I will show you a few of my favorite prophets and sibyls to show you the stunning variety of poses. A sibyl was an oracle in ancient Greece which had predicted the coming of Jesus. One can't possibly appreciate their beauty from the floor of the chapel without opera glasses. This is the prophet Daniel. Look at his beautifully foreshortened left arm draped over the book, the small figure between his knees holding up the book, and the child looking over Daniel's shoulder. Daniel looks away from the book with a furrowed brow, as if troubled by what he is reading. This is the prophet Isaiah, somewhat feminine, momentarily interrupted from his reading by an adorable putti on his right shoulder. Notice that his finger has kept his place in the book, and notice the care with which Michelangelo has painted his bare toes. The Cumaean Sibyl was the priestess presiding over the Apollonian oracle at Cumae. What an incredibly powerful Amazon-like figure Michelangelo has painted, and her wisdom-lined face, seen in profile with her flushed cheeks, is stunningly portrayed. I love the folds of her white turban and the two putis looking over her shoulder. So many of Michelangelo's thousands of drawings were lost or intentionally destroyed by him. The drawing for the Libyan Sibyl, my favorite figure in the show, is fascinating for the detailed study of the back muscles, which will ultimately be covered by the strikingly modern strapless orange gown. Clearly, it is a male model, but a female Sibyl. Look at the position of the right big toe, the two pairs of bas-relief putis in the upper corners, and the two children beneath her left elbow, and the detailing of the dress, and the dramatic contrast between the bright orange dress and the blue drapery and shadow. And look at her golden braid. Stunning. This ceiling is a dramatic lesson in foreshortening, which is defined as the technique of depicting an object or human body in a picture so as to produce an illusion of projection or extension in space. Michelangelo understands foreshortening so perfectly. In this scene of God creating the sun and the planets, look at the legs and arms of the red-robed figure of God on the left as he floats away in space, and the right arm of the figure in the upper right. And this is what Condivi had to say about Jonah. Quote, "But admirable above all the others is the prophet Jonah, placed at the head of the vault, because contrary to the form of this part of the ceiling, by force of light and shade, the torso, which is foreshortened so that it comes back away into the roof, is on the part of the arch nearest the eye, and the feet and legs, which, as it were, project forward and are on the part furthest away. This is a stupendous performance, which shows what a marvelous power was in this man of turning lines into foreshortening and perspective," unquote. Here we see the giant fish trying to swallow Jonah's left leg. Michelangelo had chosen scenes from the Old Testament as a theme for the ceiling, knowing that it was rich with possibilities, and he has designed each scene with multiple meanings. In this scene of the temptation of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from Eden, he has shown Adam and Eve twice. Instead of the apple being in the mouth of the serpent, it is in the hand of a woman who is coming out of the serpent's body. This iconic scene of God held up by many angels as he gives the spark of life to Adam is probably the most reproduced of all of Michelangelo's images. The angels are contained in a billowing maroon cape. In contrast is the diaphanous green fabric which begins on the knee of an angel and wraps around and behind God. Look at the loving exchange in the eyes of God and man. The tension of the two hands as they almost touch. And notice the beautiful left hand of God as it rests on the shoulder of an angel. I particularly love the look of the angel who is tucked in the crook of God's left arm. This is such a lyric composition. The Sistine ceiling made Michelangelo immediately famous as a fresco painter, leading to a demand for other large frescoes from the Pope, including the Last Judgment, which I am not going to cover. For the ceiling, Michelangelo was paid 3,000 ducats, or about $400,000 in today's dollars. More than 20,000 people visit the chapel every day to see these frescoes. The frescoes were a major distraction to his attempts to finish the sculptures for the tomb of Julius II. Back to Michelangelo's sculpture. In 1520, when he was 45, he accepted a commission from Cardinal Giulio de' Medici to design a tomb for the Medicis in Florence. Even though he had more than enough work for the rest of his life, he took on this project out of loyalty to the Medici family. After all, it was Lorenzo the Magnificent who had given him his start as a sculptor. Michelangelo decided to carve 4 monumental figures draped on the 2 Medici sarcophagi, representing dawn and evening for Lorenzo and day and night for his brother Giuliano. Let's start with a sarcophagus for Lorenzo. Here's what Vasari had to say about dawn. A nude woman who is such as to awaken melancholy in the soul. In her attitude may be seen her effort as she rises heavy with sleep and raises herself from her downy bed. And it seems that in awakening, she has found the eyes of that great Duke closed in death, so that she is agonized with bitter grief, weeping in her own unchangeable beauty in a token of her great sorrow, unquote. Michelangelo has been criticized for sculpting women as though they were men with breasts. After all, his models were all male. Is there any doubt in your mind that this is a torso of a woman? On Lorenzo's brother Giuliano's tomb are the figures of night and day. Night wears a diadem of or jeweled crown with a crescent moon and a star on her forehead, which holds her parted hair, which ends with a heavy braid on her breast. In front of her left arm is a mask representing unsettled dreams. With an owl, a nocturnal bird of prey looks out from under her leg. And a bundle of poppy capsules alluding to sleep is under her foot. Vasari adds, who is there who has ever seen in that art in any age, ancient or modern, statues of such a kind? For in her may be seen not only the stillness of one sleeping, but the grief and melancholy of one who has lost a great and honored possession. Day is portrayed as a Herculean figure who looks fiercely behind him. Instead of looking ahead to the future with hope, he is forced to spend his time looking over his shoulder. Day is not a hopeful figure. Unlike night, Michelangelo has given this figure an eerie quality by leaving his face unfinished. This is a dramatic contrast with the smooth and polished surface of his body. Day is among the most muscular figures Michelangelo ever sculpted. This may be a reference to the energy associated with daytime activities. The contortions of his body are so unusual, with the left leg over the right and the left arm behind his back. Michelangelo did a second Pietà, also known as the Deposition. It is one of his few sculptures which were not commissioned, and it is thought that he intended it for his own tomb. He started it when he was 72 and worked on it periodically for many years, interrupted by other projects which were thrust upon him. To the right and left are the Virgin and Mary Magdalene, and behind the twisted, lifeless body of Christ, holding most of his weight, is a hooded Nicodemus. This sculpture is one of several which remained unfinished at his death and is surrounded in controversy. It is believed that he abandoned it because he discovered a flaw in the marble, and in frustration, he intentionally broke off the left arm of Christ. Years later, an apprentice sculptor was hired to restore the sculpture. His work is evident in Mary Magdalene on the left, which is of a very different quality. It shows none of the emotion of the other three figures. What is fascinating is the various levels of finish on this piece, from Mary Magdalene to the beautiful polished torso and the right arm of Christ, to the mostly finished hooded head of Nicodemus, to the clearly unfinished heads of Christ and Mary as they touch. Some say that Nicodemus is Michelangelo's self-portrait. The last sculptures I'm going to show you were originally intended to be for the tomb of Pope Julius. The first two slaves, originally called prisoners, were finished but not included in this scaled down version of the tomb. They are now in the Louvre. The last four were never finished. Some say that in the dying slave, Michelangelo is portraying that moment at the point of death when the body is drained of the last of its vitality to become mere lifeless matter. He shows us a young man lost in a dreamlike state, released from the struggles of life. The bonds around his chest indicate his captivity. Some have doubted that this is a figure of a dying slave at all. The art critic Charles de Tolney described this work as a dreaming adolescent trying to shake off the bonds of sleep. In any case, it shows Michelangelo's genius at producing a work so filled with life that it seems almost impossible for it to be merely a lifeless stone. The rebellious slave is portrayed as trying to free himself from the fetters which hold his hands behind his back, contorting his torso and twisting his head. Other meanings which have been suggested are linked to the torments of Michelangelo's personal life. Michelangelo said, "The world is a place of tears." This statue is of a male nude which seems to carry an enormous weight on his head. Consequently, it has been named after Atlas, the proverbial ancient Titan who held up the whole world on his shoulders. His head has not been freed from the stone. The downward push of the immense weight, as well as the force of the slave pushing back up, creates a special kind of energetic tension. These are the last three of the four unfinished slaves in the Accademia Museum in Florence. They have a particular appeal to the modern eye, accustomed as we are to the loose paintings of the Impressionists of the late 19th century. Michelangelo said that the sculpture was a tool of God, not creating, but simply revealing the powerful figures already contained in the marble. His task was only to chip away the excess to reveal the figure in the stone. This is a bit of hyperbole, as Michelangelo often did study models in clay and wax, as well as hundreds of drawings before he started a figure. One can clearly recognize the grooves from a pointed chisel on the marble surface. This gives us an intimate look at Michelangelo's process. And last, changing gears one more time, as an architect, I feel I need to tell you about Michelangelo's contributions to the rebuilding of St. Peter's. In 1500, Pope Julius decided that St. Peter's Basilica, built over the grave of St. Peter, should be the largest church in Christendom, and he hired the architect Bramante to design it. This is how it looked before it was rebuilt. The Sistine Chapel can be seen to the right of the main structure. The chapel was Michelangelo's, with Michelangelo's famous Pietà, was on the left side. This image shows that the church was built on the edge of an old Roman circus. Notice the outline of the church. Bramante drew up a square plan, beautifully geometric and symmetrical, and started digging the foundations for this new massive structure. There were no piers in those days, and the engineering must have been sketchy at best. Bramante had financial problems, and Michelangelo discovered that he was using cheap materials in the foundations. He told the Pope, and this enraged Bramante. When Bramante died in 1514, Raphael, then in favor with the Pope, was appointed the new architect. He changed the design, adding a nave, and work on the foundation stopped. When Raphael died at 37 in 1520, it was Balthasar Peruzzi's turn in the barrel. After 30 years, the church was still a hole in the ground. Peruzzi died 16 years later with no progress on the foundation. In 1547, when Michelangelo was 71, Pope Paul II appointed him to be the new architect for St. Peter's. After bitterly protesting that he was a sculptor, not an architect, with no architectural training, he finally relented, and like the frescoes in the Sistine ceiling, decided to give it his best shot. Indeed, he did. He simplified and strengthened Bramante's plan, which is shown on the left, greatly thickening the walls and recognizing the entrance with a grand colonnade. Under his leadership, the structure finally began to emerge from the ground. Michelangelo's most significant contribution to the church was the design of the massive dome, 50% bigger than the one on the Capitol building in Washington, which was built 300 years later with the help of a steel frame. Bramante's dome on the left was a single dome of rather squat proportions, and Michelangelo was fearful that it would collapse. Michelangelo's design for the dome on the right, like the Duomo in Florence, designed by Brunelleschi 100 years earlier, was a double dome connected with ribs, with much taller and more elegant proportions, and structurally much stronger. For this, he did many drawings. The dome, true to his design, was finally completed in 1590, 26 years after Michelangelo's death. Although its diameter is slightly less than the Duomo in Florence, it remains the tallest dome in the world, sitting on top of the largest church in the world. It dominates the Roman skyline, which is filled with domes. Standing under the dome is an experience not soon forgotten. It is staggering to think of this being built in the 16th century without the benefit of modern engineering. Although Michelangelo felt increasingly feeble in his 80s, architectural design took much less energy than sculpting in stone. Now that his skills as an architect were recognized, in his last years, he was commissioned to design numerous other monuments in Rome, including the Campidoglio, the Laurentian Library, and several gates of the city, as well as the oversight of the construction of St. Peter's. On January 17th, 1564, a month before his 89th birthday, Michelangelo breathed his last. With attendants as witnesses, he had made his will in 3 sentences. He left his soul in the hands of God, his body to the earth, and his substance to his nearest relatives. He had outlived 6 popes, having served each one of them to the best of his ability. What about Michelangelo, the mortal? He was a humble, solitary, melancholic man who lived modestly. He said to Condivi, "However rich I may have been, I have always lived like a poor man." Although he died with a sizable estate, most of his life he was very poor, sending most of his money to his needy father and brothers in Florence. He was a slight man of 5'3" weighing about 100 pounds. He ate out of necessity rather than pleasure and needed very little sleep. He often slept in his clothes. He had a photographic memory, never forgetting what he or others had created. He was totally dedicated to his work, whatever that was at the moment, and had little time for personal relationships. A priest told him that it was a pity that he did not have a wife and children. He said, "I have only too much of a wife in this art of mine, who has always kept me in tribulation, and my children shall be the works that I may leave, which even if they are not, will live for a while." The few loves of his life included both men and women. In particular was the Marchioness Vittoria Colonna, to whom he wrote endless love sonnets, as well as Tommaso di Calibieri, to whom he wrote sonnets as well. He was in love with the physical beauty of both sexes. I think this portrait captures his personality so perfectly. When Michelangelo died, his body was smuggled out of Rome in a hay bale so that he could be properly celebrated in his hometown of Florence. His tomb, an unusual combination of sculpture and fresco, is in the church of Santa Croce in Florence, where he had wanted to be buried. Vasari said, Michelangelo was favored by the Almighty as a man perfect in every aspect of art and poetry, designed to inspire others to follow his artistic example. As it was God who brought life to man, it was Michelangelo who immortalized man's existence in paint and marble. I hope you have enjoyed this brief glimpse into the life and work of this remarkable artist who outlived Leonardo by 23 years and Raphael by 53 years, producing an extraordinary body of work, probably never to be equaled again. I have covered a lot of material in a very short time, so I have created an encore focused on just the details of the Sistine ceiling. From the Pietà to the Sistine ceiling to the Dome of St. Peter's, superlatives seem wholly inadequate to describe a man who understood so many facets of the human spirit. Thank you.
Well, Jim, that was absolutely incredible and awe-inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing so much about the life and times. And the first question that we have, which I'm not surprised, is what did you think of Charleston Heston and Rex Harrison in the 1965 film about your subject.
You know, I'm embarrassed to say I haven't seen it for a long, long time, and I've sort of forgotten it, and I need to see it again. I did, one of my earliest talks was on Vincent van Gogh, and of course I watched Irving Stone's Lust for Life, and there are a lot of distortions in the movie which I talk about, and it's on my list. I need to see the movie, and I'm sure that I'm assuming that Charlton Heston was fabulous. I've heard people say that it's a great movie, so I definitely need to see it. It's on my list.
And would you recommend the book?
The book, I read the book a second time, of course, when I was preparing for this, and I think the book is fabulous. I have not read The Lust for Life, which supposedly is quite good too, but the Agony and the Ecstasy, I think, is just a terrific book, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So one of the questions that is often asked, it's a curious thing I don't mention, but because of that poem Michelangelo wrote about painting the Sistine ceiling and how miserable he was, a myth has sort of grown up that he was actually lying on his back while he was painting it. And of course, that's not true. It's not possible that he could have been painting the ceiling on his back. And the scaffolding that he built, very complicated scaffolding, which Bramante had designed and failed at, had to be stepped because it had to be a constant distance from the ceiling, so he could stand and reach the ceiling from any level. So it was a very complicated scaffolding, but he definitely could not have been lying on his back to paint the sculpture, to paint the ceiling, I should say.
And then someone's asking about the restoration of the ceiling itself. How long did that process take, and how many people were involved?
It took 14 years, and I don't know how many people, but it was, as usual, all restorations like this, like the restoration of the Last Supper, was very controversial. There were people who thought that they were going to remove too much, and there had been numerous other restorations. There had been damage to the ceiling had leaked. There are parts, supposedly the hands of God and Adam were actually touched up by some other artist, but I don't know how many people were involved, but I'm sure there were a lot of people, and it was very, very carefully done. Because with all, I mean, in these days, we have technologies for this kind of stuff that are fabulous, and I'm sure that that most of it was probably pretty simple. Like the steam cleaning of all the architecture in Paris, it just create a lot of elbow work and gentle soaps or alcohols or whatever to get rid of the smoke, all the smoke and all that stuff that had been accumulating.
Yeah, you definitely want to be careful and not damage it, that's for sure.
Yeah, right. Well, a lot of people would have preferred it. I mean, I didn't say this, but I was totally underwhelmed the first time I saw it. I mean, it was just, there was so little color left under this smoke and grime that it didn't appeal to me at all. And the second time, it just totally blew me away.
Indeed. So people are also asking about what was his relationship with Leonardo. There seems to have been this feeling that they were not friendly and that there was great jealousy between each of them, because Leonardo also did sculpture.
Yeah, so Leonardo did not do sculpture. He was not, as I said, Leonardo looked down on sculpture and said, this is a second-rate craft. So the two of them, there was definitely a rivalry. After all, Michelangelo was the young Turk. He was, at least over 20 years younger than Leonardo, and there was some, and Leonardo was this beautiful man that everyone loved, and Michelangelo was a recluse, a little man who had a broken nose and not a very sociable person. And Leonardo was the ultimate social gadfly. And so you can imagine the kind of friction there was between them when they met in Florence, and they crossed paths in Florence quite a bit. And as I mentioned, it was Leonardo. Leonardo was on the committee to decide where to put David's sculpture, and Leonardo must have been crazy with the praise that Michelangelo got for his David, considering that he had completely dissed the whole art of sculpture.
A next question we have here is, are frescoes still being done today, or is it a lost art?
That's a good question. All I can tell you is that if you go to YouTube, you can click on fresco and you can see a guy doing fresco, and it is fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating to see it being done on YouTube. And so I don't know. I should probably do a little research on that. I suspect it is somewhere. I mean, because it's because we live in the world of possibility, that if something can be done, it's probably being done somewhere. I don't know where though. But I do urge you, if you're in the slightest bit interested in the process, to go to YouTube, because it is a kick to see it being done.
So someone's also asking, what is the difference between a mural and a fresco?
Well, a mural is just a descriptive word describing a large painting, that covers that usually a mural you think of as a mural as being on the wall. And I don't know if any of you have seen my John Singer Sargent talk, but Sargent did several murals, and they were not in fresco, they were in oil. These are huge paintings that cover, that are, I don't know how big it has to be before it's considered to be a mural, but fresco is a technique, and mural is a description of an art piece.
And then perhaps the last question this evening, what was his, or what is considered his finest work, do you think?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, I guess you'd have to say the Sistine ceiling. The ceiling is so vast and such a monument. I mean, the biggest painting in the world by a single artist. And to think that my theory is that he took on this huge project, assuming that he would just be doing the design and drawings of it, and letting fresco, there were lots of talented fresco painters around, that he'd let them do the frescoing, and then he decided he would be doing it way better than they would, and so he decided to do it all himself. But it's hard to compare apples and oranges. The Pietà, the David, the Sistine ceiling, they're so different, and each one is such an extraordinary work of art. And to think that he did them when he was relatively young. He lived to 89, and he had finished the Sistine ceiling when he was 37. And so that's I guess a really kind of an impossible question.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. It's always a pleasure to have you join us, as it is for all of our viewers. And I wanted to kind of end this evening reminding you that next month in November, we have our good friends from Fioli coming and presenting their holiday fair for us. So I hope you'll be back for that. And, Michelangelo, and doing research as I do for every presentation, there's just such an incredible amount of information. And I'm really fascinated with all his letters to his father. And in one of them, he said that the greatest sin is to waste time. And I think that for our audience this evening, anytime we have a presentation by you, Jim, is not a waste of time.
Thank you, Tom.
And that as we go forward through everything that's happening in the world today, I'll end with this from Michelangelo, where he said, take care of yourself and watch out for those you have to watch out for. For one does not die more than once, and nobody returns to put right the things done wrong. So I wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you for joining us. Take care of yourself and of each other. Good night. Thank you again, Jim.